90% of financial advisors fail in their first 3 years in the business. And even beyond that, it makes it one of the toughest industries to actually survive in, let alone thrive in and, grow a successful practice. I'm sure if you're an advisor watching this, you resonate with how difficult the industry is becoming and also maybe some of the reasons behind that really high failure rate. I've personally spoken with over 1,500 financial advisors to this point. I've worked one-to-one with over 50 of them from 6 months to a year plus at a time. I've also spoken in the communities of some of the top advisors and names in the space. And so in this video, all I really want to do is share all of my understanding of why the failure rate in the industry has become, so high and why it's becoming increasingly difficult. Honestly, my hope is just simply that as an advisor watching this, you can gain some insight into what to maybe avoid, maybe even a different perspective that you can adopt into your practice right now, and some of the ways that you can maybe make changes to avoid either the failure or even just grow at a much faster pace than other advisors do. So the first thing I want to mention is that for pretty much every single advisor I talk to, it usually never comes down to, a lack of technical capability, a lack of understanding of the financial markets, or just generally speaking, not being able to service their clients. The reason advisors fail is usually something much before that, right? And obviously, look, like everybody knows that a big piece of the financial advisory industry is being able to be a good salesman, quote unquote, right? Or at least being able to bring people in the door so you're able to convert them into becoming clients in the first place, right? And the other side of that I really, really want to mention is across every single conversation I've had with an advisor, I genuinely believe that almost 99%, maybe even more, of the industry genuinely really cares about their clients and knows that they can genuinely make an impact in the lives of so many people, right? And I know there's some controversy in some aspects of financial advisory, but I'm sure if you're an advisor, you'll understand that from a broad perspective, the majority of advisors really do care and can really make a positive impact. The problem that I see comes down to a disconnect in the way that they service their clients and approach their clients versus the way that they service and approach their prospects. I'll get into that a little bit here in a second. But that's kind of the fundamental disconnect that I think causes a lot of problems. And I talked about it over and over again with not only my clients, but also prospects that, advisors that I'm talking to. But really what it stems from is if we look at when an advisor first starts in the industry, right? I've worked with some advisors who are maybe just a few months in to some advisors who have 10 to 15 plus years under their belt. So from a broad perspective, right, it really just depends. But to start off, right, when someone starts in the industry, they're told to contact, their friends and family. They're told to maybe look at old colleagues, right? Whatever the case may be in what we call warm outreach. The issue with that warm outreach very quickly becomes that they run out of people to talk to, right? There's only very few people that you know. And again, for pretty much every single advisor I've talked to, they really hate doing the warm outreach, right? Even if you know you can help these people, even if you know there's good opportunity, especially being a young advisor, they feel like their credibility really holds them back in the sense that, I was talking to an advisor the other day who was just about 6 months into his career. And he literally said that his own grandma said, "What do you know about financial advising?" and didn't want to become a client of his. And it happens all the time, right? Really the credibility piece is definitely a struggle for a lot of advisors early on, which is definitely one factor that plays into that failure rate. But overall, what I'm trying to get at is just the fact of trying to rely on warm outreach. It usually comes from taking advice of, advisors before you, maybe older advisors. And in the end, it will run out. So that brings me to my second point, which usually the reality that most advisors lack is the ability to turn random people or cold strangers into what we call a warm audience consistently and reliably, right? Even if you're able to do it here and there, the sporadic nature of their pipeline is probably the number one issue I hear. And if I had to pick out one reason why advisors have this, very high failure rate in the industry, it's because of a sporadic and inconsistent pipeline. And obviously I'm going to break down some of the factors behind that and why they maybe struggle to solve it or, maybe aren't able to find the right solutions. I can talk about that in a second. But that inconsistency, if you as an advisor right now can probably understand why that's such a big problem. But very simply, if you have big goals for where you want your practice to be, right? I'm sure right now, if you're an advisor watching this, you're not really just hoping to survive in the industry. You really want to thrive. And so forget surviving. In order to have that really big practice, achieve all those goals that you want, you kind of need to thrive, right? And so the inconsistent pipeline, make sure that you don't really know where your next month is going to be, or next 6 months, or whatever the case may be. And then that causes stress on the rest of your business as well, right? So I've heard this from a lot of the top advisors actually that I mentioned early on in this video, where the reason that they feel the outreach layer was the first step to solve, aside from all these consistency and reliability issues that I mentioned, is that until you have the ability to not stress about your pipeline, you can't really put your full focus into your clients, right? And as I said, like every advisor I've ever spoken to really wants to make a true, genuine, positive impact in the lives of every single one of their clients and people that they speak with. But a lot of the pressure from, having to fill the pipeline and, maybe some of the reasons that we'll get to in terms of how they try to do that, that requires a lot of effort outside of servicing their client. And so that's one of the pieces I've really learned from a lot of the top advisors, a lot of the biggest names in the industry. And I think if you ask any one of them, they will say that understanding how to bring in those clients consistently will be the first piece you have to solve before you can even worry about providing the best service to your clients itself. So then stepping back a layer, like usually when advisors now come to the point where, okay, like I have inconsistency, maybe I've exhausted my warm outreach. And look, maybe you're not even early on in the business. Like this has happened to advisors I've seen across all stages and kind of the entire life cycle of the business, where there's obviously ups and downs, there's obviously inconsistency. And look, like to some extent, it is the nature of not just this business, but every business. I understand that. But at the same time, right, like having very big peaks and valleys is a lot different than having little bumps along the road. So when an advisor kind of goes to solve this, they'll go at it a few ways, right? The first step is usually they'll start attending some in-person meetings, maybe some networking events locally, even if that means like going to, different client events or just asking clients for referrals. Obviously, that's a big piece of it. And then usually with in-person meetings or networking events, it's kind of the same issue, right? Where you'll maybe talk to some people, right? Maybe some people will resonate. It's not necessarily the easiest to get to, from connection that you made at an event, right? Like someone that you spoke to actually talking about finances, right? Like that's a pretty difficult transition to make. Again, you may have wins here and there, you may get some clients, but in order to consistently and repeatedly fill the pipeline, it doesn't necessarily provide that. So I've seen that over and over again. Then the second piece is when they kind of go on to, maybe doing some of the traditional online sales whatever, systems, whatever you want to call it. The first step, obviously, cold email is something that advisors have tried for a long time. Again, I'm not going to say it doesn't work, right? For a lot of people, it does work. But that's one of the things that really relies on volume, which in turn relies on luck, right? That's a big theme that I hear from pretty much every advisor that I've spoken to who maybe struggles with any type of cold outreach online, is that a lot of it, obviously they take the mentality of a volume game. Even if you're doing cold calls, obviously, like I think it's a pretty common theme in the industry to just say, oh, it's a volume game, it's a numbers game. And I'll get into it in a second why I don't think that's the case. But when you're relying on volume, what happens is you're really just hoping that some of the people that you're pitching at or sending whatever sort of automated, kind of spammy email or phone call or whatever you're sending them, you're hoping that that resonates with the person on the other end. Now, the disconnect that happens is advisors know that their business is very high trust, very relationship based, right? It's a very, high touch personalized service. But when they're doing outreach or when they're trying to come across prospects, this goes back to the disconnect that I talked about earlier. A prospect that doesn't know you, all they can see is that you're a financial advisor, just like the other ones that have already pitched them or already tried to sell them. They don't really see what differentiates your relationship with them from anybody else. And so if you have a very relationship first business, the biggest mistake and the misconception is that the actual sales or like onboarding process starts with getting somebody on a call or, face to face. In reality, in 2026, where people are so hesitant of getting sold anything, they don't really want to get on calls with strangers or meet strangers in person. What happens is you need to understand that every single touch in that conversation that you're having with a prospect is insanely important, right? You have to build a relationship before someone's even willing to get on a call with you, right? And I think that's the disconnect that I obviously mentioned early on that I hear about over and over again, regardless of what strategy you end up using. Whether you're doing phone calls, whether you're doing cold emails, whether you're sending messages on LinkedIn, whether you're posting content, whether you're running ads, all of those have the same problem where it lacks the relationship that you want to build with your actual clients, and it's hoping that you'll get them on a call and then build that relationship. And that's the disconnect that I was talking about earlier. Going a layer deeper though, like if we're talking about specifics in terms of some of the solutions, obviously we mentioned, cold email, phone calls, LinkedIn, stuff like that. The other piece is working with a lead gen agency, right? I'm going to preface it by saying I don't have a lead gen agency. I'm not affiliated with any type of lead gen agency. So I'll say that also. But really the issue with lead gen agencies is the same exact thing. When there's a relationship that you need to have, a very high trust, very strong relationship with anybody who's going to be willing to work with you, you need to be able to build that relationship before they're ever willing to even talk to you in the first place. Okay, so now when we talk about advisors actually trying to find solutions to these problems, right? I hear a lot of the same issues over and over again, right? I'm not even going to talk about kind of getting involved in the what you're purchasing and all of those things. Obviously, those are the nitty-gritty details we can get into. But a lot of it comes down to not embracing what makes you unique as an advisor. So look, like as an advisor, there is going to be a lot of people who are very similar, right? They have the same certifications, they have the same amount of industry experience, they may work with the same amount of clients, they may work with similar clients, whatever the case may be. But you have to understand what makes you unique, right? Why should I as a prospect look at you instead of another advisor, right? A lot of the time, it's not going to come down to whatever credentials you have or whatever financial technical capability you have. It's again, what we talked about earlier, the relationship, right? Like the relationship piece is what separates it, because the same reason why I might choose my best friend to help me with something compared to a random stranger is going to be because of the relationship that I have with my best friend, right? And that's kind of, again, going back to that relationship disconnect that we talked about. But overall, what I'm trying to get at here is not embracing that unique factor. I use the saying all the time that there's a reason your clients work with you specifically and not somebody else. And a lot of the ways that advisors try to solve their outreach and sales layer ignores that unique factor. Any advisor can kind of go and, do the same exact prospecting or sales that you're doing. Then there's a high chance that you're going to be a part of that 90%, not in the sense that you're going to fail, but in the sense that you're drowning yourself out, right? If you think about an industry that has such a high failure rate, but you're doing the same exact thing that the majority does, it becomes the reason why you're a part of the majority in the sense of maybe not seeing the success you want. Does that make sense? Like overall, what I'm trying to get at is the fact that in an industry where there's such a high failure rate, doing the same thing that every other person does obviously causes a lot of downturns. And I've heard this over and over again, right? Like a lot of advisors will tell me that, yeah, I learned from my senior advisors. One of the big issues with that is that they may have been in a much different industry, a long time ago with just different rules and a different layout in terms of prospecting and sales. The other piece might be trying to do whatever they learned from their firm, right? Again, like if they're at part of a large firm, there's going to be a lot of advisors there who also don't necessarily see the most success. That's another piece. And overall, just like kind of drowning out in that sea of sameness that we talked about. Okay, so we covered a little bit of an actual specific level why advisors face that issue, right? When it comes to that gap in the way they want to serve their clients versus the way that they actually prospect and bring people in the door, right? It obviously comes from not embracing the unique factor, which is usually the types of relationships you're able to build individually as an advisor. Now, if I get into advisors approaching a way to solve that problem, it honestly comes down to the mindset. Out of every single advisor I've talked to who's actually had a lot of success, maybe they built their book to 100 million plus, maybe much beyond that. As I said, some of the top names in the industry who I've guest spoken at in their communities, stuff like that. What they always tell me is that the mindset and mastering that first is such an important layer. So what I mean by that is a lot of advisors kind of approach the business the same way they may approach investing with their clients. They know that obviously it's important to manage the expenses to an extent, but also it's important to invest in the market and get whatever X, Y, and Z return. And so overall, a lot of advisors are very, very analytical when it comes to reinvesting in their business as well, which to some extent is good, right? It can make sense to be able to reinvest in your business and analyze the numbers. But a lot of times the missing factor that I've heard over and over again from, again, some of the top advisors I've spoken to is that the investments in yourself are completely outsized compared to anything you can invest in the market, right? So you can't analyze it the same way. When I invest in myself or I invest in learning a skill or growing to some extent, I can see a 100x return in maybe just a span of a few years, or maybe a 10x return in the span of a few months, which obviously is much different from anything you can get in the market or any other investment outside of that on a normal level, at least. And so that one piece of kind of overanalyzing and being very averse to risk, it obviously comes from what I can understand. It's the nature of the business where you have to analyze risk, you have to make safe decisions oftentimes, and you have to understand where it may or may not make sense to allocate your capital, which, is totally understandable. But that often leads to a lot of overanalysis. So now if I get into the actual behaviors, right? Like I've personally worked with over 50 advisors one-on-one, and one of the most common topics that we talk about over and over again, and what they tell me is like, oh yeah, I was overthinking this piece, or I started overanalyzing this piece, even after they've decided to make a change, right? Like even beyond that, which just shows that's a very, very common behavior in the industry of just wanting to overanalyze and overthink, because that perfection when it comes to finances, right? It's a lot more important to be as close to perfect as possible. Whereas growing on your own, growing your business, it's probably going to be far from that. So that's another disconnect in the mindset that kind of causes a lot of these issues that we see when it comes to actually solving the problems that we talked about. So the other piece that really hurts advisors when it comes to solving the issue in terms of their prospecting and sales is the desperation. Look, like I mentioned it in the very beginning of this video, that 90% of the industry fails. And as a result of that, it can obviously feel for some advisors very desperate when it comes to bringing on clients. If they're in a stage where they maybe haven't brought in a client in a long time, or they're just underperforming their goals, you can start to build up that desperation in terms of every single person you talk to, you know that you kind of need a conversion, right? Or you really need to get clients. That mindset really causes a lot of downturn, because what happens is it's very evident in everything you say. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you've heard the term commission breath. That's a really real thing. Like, if you look at advisors who are selling in any capacity, whether that's in person, whether that's in your advertisements, whether that's in, the cold emails, cold DMs, phone calls that you're doing, if you're really desperate, it's so easy for the person on the other end to see that. And just the law of attraction is that if you feel that someone really, really needs something from you, you're actually going to drive away from that. And that happens over and over again. And so just detaching from that outcome, I think, is such an important piece that makes such a big impact. Obviously, we practice it with all the advisors I work with, but even what I've heard from, again, other advisors who I've never worked with personally, just knowing that, like, no matter what the outcome may actually be, if you're super attached to that end result, it's going to be very difficult, right? Again, going back to that theme, the disconnect between the way you service clients versus your prospects, right? When you're working with clients, you know that, you're going to do your best. You're going to do everything you can to make your service valuable to them. And after that, whatever happens, happens, right? Whereas on the prospecting side, every single conversation may feel life or death, because you know you have to grow your practice. And that desperation really hurts a lot of the advisors that I've spoken to. Okay, so the third piece that I think really hurts is looking for certainty, right? And again, like, the big theme of this video is disconnect. When you look at advisors who maybe work with their clients, and the kind of what they tell their clients is that obviously there's risk in investing in the market or investing in anything, and there's not really any certainty on what you're going to get, right? You can make assumptions, you can make predictions, you can use your best guess, you can use your best feeling, whatever you want to call it, make your plan based on numbers, whatever it is, but there is no certainty. But then on the other side, when it comes to growing their business, they kind of want to always go the certain route, right? I hear it all the time. Advisors will tell me, like, yeah, I really wanted to solve X, Y, and Z problem in my business, but I just wasn't sure if this solution was going to solve it. And so I decided to just wait, right? That looking for certainty almost always comes with waiting way too long to make a decision. Going back to what I said about overanalyzing, looking for certainty is one of the worst things you can do when it comes to looking for a way to actually grow, because you're never going to actually find it, right? You're going to be kind of looking for that certainty essentially forever. And until that comes, you're just not going to feel like you're going to have the option to grow, right? And that's one thing that I'll actually even go back to, where I've spoken with so many advisors who they're telling me about their business, they're telling me about all the problems they're facing, and maybe that they're looking for a solution for it, right? And then they say that, yeah, I have a few things I'm looking at and I'm deciding which one's the best way to go. Okay, cool. And then I'll talk to them 6 months later and they actually won't be in the business anymore. This has happened to me actually in the last just 3 months. I've had 5 of these conversations with advisors who said they had whatever problems, they wanted to solve them. But eventually, I talked to them 6 months later, they never chose anything to solve those problems, and now they're no longer in the business, right? And for some reason, I think this gets lost because, like, obviously the easy mentality is like, oh, that's not going to be me. Like, that's not going to happen to me, when that's kind of what everybody says, obviously, at that stage. And so looking for that certainty, I think, is a third piece from a mindset level that really hurts a lot of advisors. The advisors I've worked with that have seen the most success, both personally or even the advisors I've spoken to, as I said, are kind of some of the top names in the industry. They always told me where it's like, there's always risk involved. And my biggest piece was I'm uncomfortable with making uncomfortable decisions, right? And I think any business owner would kind of say something along those lines, regardless of whether it's in this industry or not. I obviously feel the same thing in my business, right? I made a lot of uncomfortable decisions, but the nature of uncomfortable decisions is that most people will avoid them. And the fact that most people are going to avoid them is what helps you stand out, right? So the thing we started this video with is why 90% of advisors fail. But obviously the majority of advisors will never make that uncomfortable decision and they'll never take that risk. And so if you as an advisor are willing to do something that's a little bit risky, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, in whatever way that is, when it comes to, trying to fix the problems that we talked about when it comes to the sales aspect, right? When you're able to make that uncomfortable decision, you're already making yourself stand out in the best way possible from everybody else, right? And look, like, not all decisions are going to work out, right? Like, I've heard it over and over again. Advisors will make a decision and they will fail, right? That always is going to happen. That's just the nature of any type of risk, right? You're not going to win all of them, and that's the nature of it. But being able to understand that looking for certainty is not going to help you as much as being willing to be uncomfortable, That's kind of the piece that I think is really important to mention. I felt that from myself, from every single business owner I've talked to, and obviously all the advisors that I've spoken with as well. Okay, and the last piece that I want to mention, it kind of goes back to what I said about how a lot of advisors, they'll really treat it as doing the industry standard or doing what every other advisor is doing. And that usually comes down to taking the easy route, right? And again, if we're going back to the topic that we're talking about here in terms of their sales system and really being able to build that consistent pipeline, looking for the easy route almost certainly means that it's not going to work out, right? And the reason that is because in an industry where 90% of people fail, obviously the majority of people, it's just human nature, will take the easy route. And by the nature of it, the easy route will fail, right? Because if everybody could just do the easy thing and see success, then we wouldn't have the failure rate that we're talking about here. But I see that over and over again. I think a lot of advisors really do understand that, and they understand that like it's not going to be easy, yet the easy route is just so tempting, right? It's just, as I said, it's human nature to want to go the easiest way. But I think, again, going back to my last point about being able to be uncomfortable, constantly having that mindset of, okay, like if this is easy, like what is kind of the caveat? Like what's going to make me not see success in this way, right? Or even what can I do that's going to put me in a more uncomfortable position that I think can actually push me forward more, but it may be a greater risk, right? I think that mindset serves a lot of people a lot better than looking for the easy way out. And it's unfortunate, right? Like, again, as I said, pretty much every single advisor I've spoken with is genuinely very caring. They really want to support their clients. They know they can actually really help their clients, and really anybody. But again, like they just don't get the time of day because they aren't able to understand why people aren't willing to work with them. And it usually comes with some of these reasons in terms of not being able to build that consistent sales system and pipeline that they need. So overall, that was just kind of my rant and spiel there. I mean, I hope it was a little bit useful, at least in the sense of understanding the perspectives that at least I've heard from advisors I've worked with, spoken with, maybe interviewed in terms of some of the top names in the industry. And if you actually look at some of my other videos, you may see what I mean by that. I have some of the master classes, interviews, and stuff posted. But really, what it comes down to is understanding that there's always going to be a disconnect for the majority of advisors when it comes to that 90% failure rate between the way they want to service their clients in a very relationship first and trust-based way versus the way that they actually end up doing their prospecting in a very transactional, very salesy way, right? The layer to solving that is understanding the mindset behind not being desperate, behind not overanalyzing and actually wanting to take risk, not looking for certainty because in the end, in life, really, there is none. And then the other piece is not looking for the easy way out because if everybody could do it, that's why everybody would succeed in the business, which as we know here from this video is not the case. So I can explain from my perspective, right, out of all the advisors I work with, the really big solution we aim to provide is bridging that disconnect between the way that you look for clients and the way you want to service your clients, right? Whatever that means for you and embracing the unique factor of what you are as an advisor. And as I said, like, there's a reason your clients work with you specifically. You want to embrace that. And that's exactly what we try to bring out. Generally speaking, most of the advisors I work with are able to build that consistent pipeline by adding 2 to 3 ideal clients every month. That means adding anywhere from 1 million to 5 million plus in their AUM. And again, a lot of what we do really comes down to mastering the mindset first and then implementing the systems on top of that, because just having random scattered pieces here and there is never going to work as well as one combined system that really pushes your pipeline forward consistently. So if that sounds interesting, if you're an advisor who kind of understands the mindset pieces that I broke down here, I actually incentivize those behaviors and understanding that way, which if you book a call with me down below, you'll see what I mean by incentivizing those behaviors, because those are the advisors I know are going to see the most success, and I want to work with them as much as possible. So hopefully this video was helpful. That's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching.